Okay, we're going to cover the central nervous system first and then the peripheral nervous system next. So brain and spinal cord. So where does the processing of information occur in the nervous system? So each major parts of the brain, so you have the cerebrum, cerebellum, brainstem, is responsible for some sort of processing and relaying information to the rest of your body. The spinal cord is like the main communication link that connects the brain to the rest of your body. So there's specific cells, the cells of the nervous system, that transmit these electrical signals to various organs in the body are called the neurons. So your brain is full of neural connections. Your spinal cord and nerves are a bunch of neurons working together. So the control point of the central nervous system is the brain. So this is where all the major information processing is happening. The brain is constantly changed or is influenced by interactions with the environment. So like your sensory organs are relaying information from your environment that the brain is going to process. Sensory experience changes many of the patterns of neural connections in the brain, and stem cells in the brain produce new neurons throughout life. So many of these new cells originate in the regions associated with learning and memory. So whenever you learn a new task, there's going to be some new neural connections happening, and the more times you do that task, that connection becomes more solidified and stronger, so then you can do that task more efficiently and fast. A large cluster of neurons and other cells make up the spinal cord. So here's your spinal cord. The spinal cord is the main communication link between the brain and the rest of the body. So there's all these other nerves coming off your spinal cord. It carries thousands of signals at once between the central and peripheral nervous system. So if you get in an accident and your spinal cord gets severed at a certain point, that will dictate if you're like paraplegic, which is like your legs don't work anymore, or quadriplegic, which your arms or legs don't, or arms and legs don't work. So depending on where your injury is, that can be, higher up is a worse injury than lower down. 31 pairs of spinal nerves branch out from the spinal cord, so you have lots of nerves coming from there, connecting the brain to different parts of the body. Certain kinds of information, like many reflexes, are actually processed directly in the spinal cord. So some of your fast reflexes, which we'll talk about, don't even get to your brain for processing. It happens very quickly, just relayed to your spinal cord. So it's an automatic response to a stimulus. Alright, so parts of the brain here. We have the cerebrum, which is the largest part of your brain in the human. The cerebrum is responsible for all of your voluntary or conscious activities of your body. It's also the site of where intelligence, learning, and judgment happen. So judgment is like your prefrontal cortex here that actually does not develop fully until you're 25. So that's why they say the prefrontal cortex is like long-term planning. So teenagers sometimes do things a little erratically. Technically because their prefrontal cortex is not fully developed yet. You have a left and right hemisphere, so each hemisphere deals mainly with the opposite side. So like the left hemisphere controls things on your right hand side of your body, and the right hemisphere controls things on your left hand side, and this thing called the corpus callosum connects the two hemispheres. Each hemisphere has different lobes, which we're not going to have you guys memorize these lobes at all, but there's 4 lobes: the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is for hearing and smelling, so notice this is kind of near your ears, your nose, you'd kind of get towards your nose area. The occipital lobe is for your vision, so actually you have nerves that go to the back here that figures out what you're seeing. The parietal lobe for reading and speech. So obviously if you get damaged in one part of a brain, that's going to kind of figure out if you get some sort of brain injury in the temporal lobe, you might have issues hearing or smelling, so that want to be careful with your brain there. The cerebral cortex is part of your cerebrum. It processes information from sense organs and controls body movements. It's like sense organs, like your eyes, your nose, tongue, things like that. the limbic system in your cerebrum right here. That controls things with emotion, behavior, memory. They have all been linked to many structures that make up the limbic system. For example, a region deep within the brain is called the amygdala, has been associated with emotional learning, including fear and anxiety, as well as formation of long-term memories. The limbic system is also associated with the brain's pleasure center. So this is the region that produces feelings of satisfaction and well-being. So it got cut off here, but this is the part of the brain that's affected by drugs. So that part got cut off by drugs. So when you take some sort of narcotic or any sort of other drugs, that affects your limbic system, which again, why sometimes it increases the pleasure there. So it manipulates your pleasure center. Drugs. Okay. Thalamus and hypothalamus, deep in here in the cerebrum, they are found between the brainstem and the cerebrum. The thalamus receives messages from sensory receptors, so again, like your eyes, your taste buds, ears, throughout the body, and then relays that information to the proper region of the cerebrum for further processing. The hypothalamus is over here too, is a control center for things like hunger, thirst, fatigue, anger, body temperature. So hypothalamus has to do with releasing hormones. So it coordinates the nervous and the endocrine system. So the hypothalamus will send the chemical signals, the hormones that will manage these situations here. So if you're hungry, it's going to signal things with your stomach to start churning and getting ready for food. The cerebellum, which is back over here, second largest region in the human brain. Information about muscle and joint position as well as other sensory inputs is sent to the cerebellum. So for example, although the commands to move muscles come from the cerebral cortex, sensory information allows the cerebellum to coordinate and balance these actions or the actions of these muscles. So when you begin any new activity involving muscle coordination, it is the cerebellum that learns the movements and coordinates the actions of individual muscles when the movement is repeated. So this has to do a lot with your coordination and balance, your cerebellum. The brainstem, which is like the most primal part of your brain, the brainstem connects the brain to the spinal cord. The brainstem includes three regions: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. Each of these regions regulates the flow of information between the brain and the rest of the body. So functions such as regulation of blood pressure, heart rate, breathing, and swallowing are controlled by the brainstem. So much of your really necessary life functions are controlled by the brainstem. So the brainstem keeps the body functioning even when you have lost consciousness due to sleep or injury. So if you're in a coma, your brainstem's still working. It's just the cerebrum is not conscious. So brainstem, again, we share similar it's the same thing with all animals. The brainstem controlling heart rate, breathing, all your main life functions are based on the brainstem. So if that got injured, that would not be good. Probably would not be living. All right, now to the peripheral nervous system. So how does the central nervous system, your brain and spinal cord, receive sensory information? The sensory division of the peripheral nervous system transmits impulses from the sense organs to the central nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system, peripheral means like side. So it's all of your nerves and everything in everything besides your brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system consists of all the nerves and associated cells that are part of the brain or spinal cord. So cranial nerves go back through openings in the skull and stimulate regions of the neck and head, or head and neck. Spinal nerves stimulate the rest of the body. So major thing on this page is all the nerves that are associated cells that are part of the brain or spinal cord. Again, peripheral nervous system means side. So all of your side nerves that are coming from that are connecting the outside world to your spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system consists of two major divisions, the sensory division and the motor division. The sensory division transmits impulses from sense organs, hence why it's called sensory, to the central nervous system. So it's taking in information from your environment, the sensory part of your peripheral nervous system. The motor division of the peripheral nervous system transmits impulses from the central nervous system to muscles or glands. So sensory goes from like the outside to your central nervous system. Motor goes from your central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, to your muscles or other glands. Sensory receptors are cells that transmit information about changes in the internal and external environment. These changes are called stimuli. So for example, it could be like sound, a sound that was made, light, etc. So for example, the sensory neurons receive like the sound from your phone alerting you that you have a text message. So your ears have nerves that receive that information. They're going to relay that to your brain for it to process. These are all the different types of sensory receptors. We're not going to be testing you on them, but like a chemoreceptor responds to chemicals like things that you're eating, chemicals that you're smelling. Photoreceptor responding to light, so your eyes are going to be have a lot of photoreceptors there. Mechanoreceptor is responding to different pressure, touch, stretching, so lots of your skin, parts outside your body have a lot of mechanoreceptors and so forth. There we go. So when stimulated, sensory receptors transmit impulses to the sensory neurons. So it's going to be like, hey, I notice there's some flowers here. Your photoreceptors in your eyes notice the color. The chemoreceptors in your nose notice the smell and relay that information to your brain saying, oh, this is a tulip. So from your memory of a tulip, your chemoreceptors know that smell and relay that information to your brain. Your brain processes it saying, oh, that's a tulip. So again, sensory neurons then transmit impulses to the central nervous system. So the motor division, how do muscles and glands receive commands from the central nervous system? The motor division of the peripheral nervous system transmits impulses from the central nervous system to the muscles. So it's going to relay information saying, okay, like walk away from this stimuli or walk towards the stimuli. Once it has gathered and processed sensory information, the nervous system sends commands to the rest of the body. The motor division of the peripheral nervous system transmits impulses from the central nervous system to the muscle. So after it processes information, it's going to send out to the body what it should do. So that's the motor division. Motor means like to move. Okay, so these messages are relayed through one of two divisions, the somatic nervous system or the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system regulates body activities that are under conscious control, like voluntary movements, such as moving your skeletal muscles, like to scratch your nose. That would be a somatic nervous system under the motor nervous system. Most of the time you have control over skeletal muscle movement, but when your body is in danger, the central nervous system may take over. So voluntary control, voluntary movement uses motor neurons of the somatic nervous system. Impulses originating in the brain are carried through the spinal cord, and then the messages are sent from the spinal cord, causing the contractions that produce voluntary movement. So again, voluntary movements could be like walking, typing, like using your phone. That's a voluntary movement that's controlled by the somatic nervous system. Reflex arcs. You know what? I'm going to continue this on the next one.